The October wind of 1878 carried the acrid scent of coal smoke through the streets of Boston. But Charlotte Whitmore barely noticed as she pressed her trembling palms against the cold window pane of her father's study. The amber glow of gaslights flickered along Beacon Hill's cobblestone streets, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock her desperate situation. "The wedding is set for December 15th, William Whitmore announced without looking up from his railroad contracts, his steel-gray voice cutting through the evening stillness like a blade through silk. Harrison Blackwood has been most generous with his terms. Charlotte's reflection in the window showed a young woman whose auburn hair caught the lamplight like burnished copper, but her emerald eyes held a terror that made her chest constrict painfully. Harrison Blackwood was 43 years old, twice widowed under suspicious circumstances, with hands that felt like dead fish when he kissed her glove, and eyes that lingered on her body in ways that made her skin crawl with revulsion. The memory of their last encounter flooded back with nauseating clarity. How he had cornered her in the conservatory during her father's Christmas party. His whiskey breath hot and fetid against her neck as he whispered about the intimate privileges of marriage. When she had tried to pull away, his grip had tightened on her wrist with bruising force, leaving purple marks that had lasted for weeks. "Father, please." Charlotte's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. "I cannot marry him. He frightens me in ways I cannot even describe." William Whitmore finally lifted his pale eyes from the documents, and Charlotte saw in his weathered face the same ruthless calculation that had built their railroad empire from nothing. At 55, her father had become a man who measured everything in terms of profit and loss, including his own daughter. "Fear is a luxury we cannot afford, Charlotte. Your marriage to Blackwood will secure his Colorado rail lines for our western expansion. The union is worth more than $3 million in government contracts." His voice carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Your personal feelings are irrelevant to the family's prosperity." But he told me things, Father. Terrible things about what he expects from a wife. The way he spoke about his previous marriages. Charlotte's voice broke as she remembered Blackwood's graphic descriptions of his marital rights, delivered with a smile that never reached his cold eyes. "Harrison Blackwood controls the mountain passes through Colorado Territory. His cooperation is essential if we are to complete the transcontinental expansion before our competitors." William Whitmore's expression hardened further. "You will learn to appreciate his qualities in time, just as your mother learned to appreciate mine." The mention of her mother sent a chill through Charlotte's bones. Mary Whitmore had died when Charlotte was 12, officially from consumption. But Charlotte had always wondered about the bruises she'd glimpsed beneath her mother's powder and the way she'd flinched whenever father raised his voice. "And if I refuse?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch across eternity. Outside, a carriage clattered past on the cobblestones, its iron wheels ringing against stone like a funeral bell. When her father finally spoke, his voice held the chill of a Massachusetts winter. "Then you will find yourself with nothing, Charlotte. No inheritance, no family, no place in decent society. I'll see to it that you're branded as mentally unstable. There are institutions for hysterical women who refuse to accept their duties. You'll spend the rest of your life in a madhouse, forgotten by everyone who once knew your name." The threat wasn't idle. Charlotte had heard whispers about other young women from prominent families who had simply vanished after refusing advantageous marriages committed to asylums on the word of their fathers and husbands. "The choice is yours." William Whitmore continued returning his attention to his contracts. "Marry Blackwood and live as a wealthy woman, or defy me and discover what happens to disobedient daughters. I suggest you spend the coming weeks learning gratitude." That night, Charlotte lay awake in her canopied bed, staring at the painted ceiling while tears traced cold paths down her cheeks. In her nightstand drawer lay a letter from Blackwood delivered that morning, describing in explicit detail what he intended to do to her on their wedding night. The words still burned in her mind, like brands, each sentence more horrifying than the last. It was Margaret O'Brien, the Irish cook, who had raised Charlotte after her mother's death, who provided the lifeline she desperately needed. The older woman found Charlotte weeping in the garden the next morning, surrounded by the withered remains of her mother's rose bushes. "There's another way, child." Margaret whispered, her weathered hands gentle as they wiped away Charlotte's tears. "I've been saving money for 20 years, and I know where your father keeps his safe combination. My cousin Emma runs a boarding house in Denver Territory. She'd take you in, no questions asked. I couldn't ask you to sacrifice everything for me." "You're not asking. I'm offering." Margaret's gray eyes blazed with determination. "I watched your dear mother fade away under that monster's control, and I'll be damned if I let him destroy you too. There's enough money to get you safely west and documents that'll give you a new identity if needed." 3 days later, Charlotte slipped from the house before dawn, with nothing but a small carpet bag and the weight of Margaret's sacrifice heavy on her heart. As the hired carriage carried her through Boston's empty streets toward the railroad station, every shadow seemed to hide one of her father's agents. Every sound made her heart race with terror. But as the westbound train carried her away from the familiar landmarks of her childhood, Charlotte felt something she had never experienced before: the terrifying, exhilarating sensation of absolute freedom. For the first time in her 19 years, her future was her own to determine. She had no idea that freedom would demand a price higher than she could possibly imagine. The Wyoming Territory stretched endless and empty, beneath a sky so vast it made Charlotte dizzy to contemplate its immensity. After 4 days on the train, watching civilization gradually thin and disappear, she had transferred to a stagecoach in Cheyenne for the final leg to Denver. The conveyance was cramped and uncomfortable, carrying passengers and mail through country that seemed actively hostile to human existence. "First time out west, Miss, or Wyoming?" asked Samuel Morrison, a traveling salesman with kind eyes and tobacco-stained fingers, who sat across from her. Charlotte managed a nervous smile, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Yes, I'm visiting family." The lie came easily now after days of practice. What she didn't tell him was that her hands hadn't stopped trembling since boarding the stage that morning. Every mile carried her farther from the world she knew, deeper into territory, where her father's influence might not reach, but where other dangers surely waited. Beautiful country once you get used to it. Morrison continued gesturing toward the window, where endless grassland rolled away toward distant mountains. Course it can be dangerous for folks who don't know its ways. Indians, outlaws, weather that can kill you if you're not prepared. Charlotte nodded politely, but her attention was drawn to the driver's increasingly erratic behavior. Ben Crowley had seemed competent enough when they'd started, but now she noticed how he kept checking his pocket watch and scanning the horizon with nervous intensity. The attack came without warning as they descended into a valley carved by wind and time into fantastic shapes. The first rifle shot cracked like thunder, sending their lead horse crashing to earth in a tangle of leather traces and screaming flesh. The stagecoach tilted wildly, lurched sideways, and began a sickening roll that seemed to last forever. Charlotte found herself thrown against the roof, then the side wall, then into a chaos of arms and legs and flying luggage as the world turned upside down. Morrison's sample case exploded open, scattering patent medicines across the splintered floorboards. When the motion finally stopped, Charlotte lay stunned on what had been the ceiling, her blue traveling dress torn and blood running from a gash on her forehead. "Driver's dead," called a voice rough with whiskey and violence. "Guard 2, just like we planned. Check for passengers worth keeping alive." Terror flooded Charlotte's veins like ice water as the horrible truth sank in. This wasn't random violence. It was a carefully orchestrated ambush. The driver had been working with the outlaws, leading them into a trap with deadly precision. Rough hands hauled her from the wreckage, ignoring her cry of pain. The man who gripped her arm had pale eyes like winter frost and a face that spoke of too much violence and not enough conscience. A jagged scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, testament to some long-ago knife fight. "Well, looky here." He drawled, his gaze traveling over her expensive dress with obvious calculation. "Got ourselves a real lady. Eastern money by the look of them fancy clothes." Morrison lay motionless nearby, his head twisted at an unnatural angle, his kindly eyes staring sightlessly at the vast Wyoming sky. Charlotte's stomach lurched as she realized she was completely alone with these murderers. "Please," she gasped, struggling against the outlaw's iron grip. "Take my money, my jewelry, anything you want, but please don't." "Oh, we'll take everything, honey." The scarred man interrupted with a laugh that made her blood freeze. "Starting with finding out who's gonna pay to get you back in one piece." He dragged her toward a cluster of horses, hidden behind a rock outcropping where two more men waited with rifles and cruel grins. Charlotte recognized the type from newspaper stories, frontier predators who preyed on travelers foolish enough to venture into the territories without proper protection. The crack of a rifle shot split the afternoon air like the voice of divine judgment. The scarred outlaw's grip on Charlotte's arm suddenly went slack, and he pitched forward into the dusty earth without another word, blood spreading from the neat hole between his shoulder blades. Charlotte spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs, and found herself staring up at a figure silhouetted against the ridge above. The man who descended toward her moved with the fluid grace of someone born to this harsh country, every step calculated and sure. He was Cheyenne, that much was immediately clear from his high cheekbones and bronze skin. His buckskin jacket, darkened with age and decorated with intricate beadwork, hung loose over broad shoulders that spoke of a lifetime's hard living. Long black hair, streaked with premature silver, was tied back with a strip of leather that had seen many seasons of sun and wind. But it was his eyes that held Charlotte transfixed, dark as midnight, intelligent and completely unreadable. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much death and learned to live with the weight of necessary violence. In his hands, a long rifle that still smoked from its recent use. He held it with the casual competence of someone who had never missed an important shot, never hesitated when killing became necessary for survival. "Now, can you ride?" His voice was low-accented with something that wasn't quite English, though his words were perfectly clear. Charlotte looked around at the scene of carnage, dead horses, overturned Coach Morrison's body, already attracting flies in the afternoon heat. "There's nothing left to ride." He whistled sharp and clear as a hawk's cry. From behind a stand of buffalo grass emerged a magnificent paint horse, its black and white patches gleaming in the late afternoon sun. The animal approached without hesitation, nuzzling the warrior's shoulder as he caught its rope halter with gentle familiarity. "I'm Takoda," he said simply, lifting Charlotte onto the horse's back with surprising gentleness. His hands were calloused, but careful, treating her with the same respect he might show a wounded bird. "Charlotte," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Charlotte Whitmore." Something flickered in his dark eyes at the mention of her surname, recognition perhaps, or something darker. But before she could ask what it meant, he was swinging up behind her, his arms coming around her to grip the reins. They rode through the gathering dusk, the paint horse's hoofbeats drumming a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth. Takoda seemed tireless, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit, while Charlotte dozed fitfully against his chest, despite the impropriety of their closeness. She had never been so near to a man who wasn't her father or a carefully chaperoned suitor, but exhaustion and shock made social conventions seem meaningless. There was something deeply reassuring about Takoda's presence, a sense of competence and protection that she had never experienced in her sheltered Boston life. When dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, they made camp beside a creek that ran clear and cold between banks lined with cottonwoods. Charlotte slid from the horse and immediately collapsed to her knees, her legs too weak to support her weight after the long night's ride. "Gather wood," Takoda said, unsaddling the horse with economical movements that spoke of long practice. Charlotte stared at him blankly. In her father's house, servants had tended the fires. She had never so much as lit a lamp by herself, let alone built a fire from nothing but wood and flint. I don't understand. I've never... Takoda studied her with those dark, unreadable eyes, taking in her expensive clothes, her soft hands, the way she held herself, even in exhaustion. Everything about her screamed wealth and privilege, complete inexperience with the harsh realities of frontier life. "City woman," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Heat flooded Charlotte's cheeks as she realized how helpless she must appear. "Boston. My father owns the Western Union Railroad Company. Whitmore." The name fell from his lips like a stone dropped into still water, heavy with implications she didn't understand. Something cold and dangerous flickered in his expression, quickly suppressed but unmistakably hostile. "You know my father." But Takoda had already turned away. His attention focused on caring for the horse. "Wood," he repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "Dead branches only. Green wood won't burn properly." The next hour was the most humbling of Charlotte's 19 years. Her hands, soft from a lifetime of privilege, blistered within minutes of gathering fallen branches. Her back ached from bending over her expensive dress snagged on thorns, and twice she broke into tears of frustration when dry twigs crumbled in her grip. Takoda said nothing during her struggles, but she caught him watching her with something that might have been approval when she finally managed to collect a small pile of suitable kindling. His silence was somehow more encouraging than empty praise would have been. He showed her how to arrange the wood properly, his movements swift and practiced, as he produced flint and steel from a pouch at his belt. Within moments, sparks caught in a nest of dry grass, and soon a small fire crackled cheerfully between them. "Why did you help me?" Charlotte asked as she warmed her hands over the flames, grateful for their heat, as the morning air carried an unexpected chill. Takoda was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, but there was an undercurrent of something darker, more personal than simple altruism. 3 days ago, men with rifles attacked my people's winter camp, killed my grandmother and an elder who had lived through 70 summers, stole horses and supplies we need to survive the coming cold. He gestured toward the distant wreckage of the stagecoach. "I was tracking them when I found you. So you weren't trying to rescue me specifically?" "No. But when I saw you with those men..." He shrugged, but Charlotte sensed there was more to the story than he was telling. "My grandmother taught me that strength should protect the innocent. You seemed innocent enough." Charlotte absorbed this, trying to reconcile the quiet-spoken man beside her with the deadly warrior who had killed 3 men without apparent hesitation. "What happens now? I take you to safety. But first I finish what I started." His dark eyes met hers across the dancing flames. "The men who raided our camp work for a cattle baron named Burke Hanlon. He pays them to drive my people from our hunting grounds so his herds can graze for free." The name meant nothing to Charlotte, but she filed it away for future consideration. There was something in Takoda's tone that suggested this Hanlon was more than just another frontier criminal. He was someone with enough power and influence to organize systematic attacks on Native American communities. "How far to safety?" she asked. 4 days to Bitter Creek Station, maybe 5 if we avoid the main trails." His gaze took in her expensive dress, her soft hands, the impractical shoes that were already beginning to fall apart. Hard traveling through country that doesn't forgive mistakes. Charlotte thought of her father's ultimatum, of Harrison Blackwood's cruel promises, of the suffocating weight of expectations that had followed her every breath since childhood. The wilderness might be dangerous, but it was honest in its threats, unlike the civilized world she had fled. "I don't have anywhere safe to go back to," she said quietly. "I chose freedom over duty when I left Boston. Now I have to learn what that choice really means." Takoda nodded slowly, as if her answer satisfied something in him. Then we better teach you how to survive out here. Because in this country, city ways will get you killed faster than a rattlesnake bite. Over the next 3 days, Charlotte began her education in frontier survival under Takoda's patient but demanding tutelage. He showed her how to read the weather by the color of the sky, how to find water by following animal trails, how to move quietly through brush without leaving obvious tracks for pursuers to follow. Her transformation was gradual but profound. Her hands blistered and bled from gathering firewood and learning to use a knife. But they also grew calloused and strong. Her feet developed painful sores inside her ruined shoes, but her step became surer on rough ground. Every muscle in her body ached from unaccustomed exertion. But she could feel herself growing harder, more resilient. More importantly, her confidence began to build. Each small success, starting a fire on her own, skinning the rabbit Takoda had snared, reading the signs that warned of approaching weather, added to her growing sense of competence. She was no longer the helpless girl who had fled Boston in terror. On their 4th morning together, as they prepared to break camp, beside a stream that tasted of snowmelt and stone, Charlotte worked up the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her since their first meeting. "You recognized my father's name when I mentioned it," she said, trying to keep her voice casual while she rolled up her blanket. "How do you know William Whitmore?" Takoda's hands stilled on the leather straps he was adjusting, and for a moment Charlotte thought he wouldn't answer. The silence stretched uncomfortably before he finally spoke, his voice carefully controlled. 2 years ago, my younger brother Ayanna was killed during what your people called a land dispute. White men with rifles came in the night, shot him down while he slept beside our family's fire. They left his body for the crows and took our best horses. Charlotte felt her stomach clench with foreboding as she heard the pain underlying his measured words. "I'm sorry. That's a terrible loss. Those rifles came from your father's railroad." Takoda continued, his dark eyes meeting hers across the dying embers of their campfire. "We found the shipping records in one of the dead raiders' saddlebags. Weapons manufactured in Springfield, Massachusetts, shipped west on Whitmore trains, sold to Burke Hanlon's men through a shell company based in Denver." The words hit Charlotte like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs. Her comfortable life in Boston, her expensive clothes and private tutors and beautiful rooms filled with imported furniture, all of it built on blood and theft and the systematic destruction of people like Takoda's family. But there was something else in his tone, a personal edge that suggested this wasn't just about business or politics. This was about family, about a brother who had died because of weapons her father had provided to his killers. "I didn't know," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks as the full implications sank in. "I swear on my mother's grave, I didn't know what he was doing out here." "I believe you," Takoda replied, but his voice remained distant, evaluating. "The question is, what will you do now that you do know?" Before Charlotte could answer, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley, carried on the morning wind that brought the scent of dust and leather, and something darker, the unmistakable smell of men who lived by violence. Takoda was on his feet instantly, his rifle in his hands, as 3 mounted men emerged from a grove of cottonwoods downstream. Even at a distance, Charlotte could see that these weren't random travelers. They rode with the purposeful formation of hunters who had found their prey. "Well, well," called the rider in the center, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "If it isn't Miss Charlotte Whitmore playing at being a frontier woman." Charlotte's blood turned to ice as she recognized the voice. Calvin Dorsey, her father's chief enforcer, the man who broke strikes and intimidated union organizers with brass knuckles and carefully applied violence. He was leaner than she remembered, hardened by weeks of pursuit through hostile territory. But his pale eyes still held the same cruel intelligence that had made him so valuable to her father. "Surprised to see me, honey?" Calvin's grin showed teeth stained with tobacco juice as he urged his horse closer to the creek bank. "Your daddy's been worried sick about his little girl." Sent me and the boys to bring you home, safe and sound. The lie rolled off his tongue with practiced ease. But Charlotte could see the truth in the way his companions positioned themselves to cut off potential escape routes. These men hadn't come to rescue her, they had come to drag her back to a fate worse than death. They figured you might have gotten yourself mixed up with some unsavory types. Calvin continued, his pale gaze fixed on Takoda with unmistakable hostility. Good thing we found you before this savage could corrupt you any further. Takoda's response was swift and deadly accurate. His rifle cracked like thunder, and the man to Calvin's left pitched from his saddle with a scream that was cut short by the creek's rushing water. The paint horse reared and whinnied in terror as the other two riders wheeled their mounts and spurred desperately for cover behind a fallen log. Jesus Christ! Calvin shouted from behind his makeshift barrier, blood seeping through his shirt where Takoda's bullet had creased his shoulder. I got a federal warrant for that girl, you red bastard. You're interfering with official business. Show me your badge. Takoda called back calmly, never taking his eyes off the spot where Calvin had taken cover. Don't need no badge when I'm doing the Lord's work, Calvin snarled. That girl's daddy wants her home where she belongs, not running around with murdering heathens like you. Charlotte felt her world tilt as she realized the full scope of her father's reach. Even here, hundreds of miles from Boston, his influence could still find her. Calvin's presence meant that William Whitmore was using every resource at his disposal to reclaim his wayward daughter, regardless of her wishes or well-being. They know who you are, Takoda observed grimly, his rifle still trained on Calvin's position. Your father's reach is longer than either of us thought. The standoff lasted for nearly an hour with occasional shots exchanged, but neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Finally, Calvin seemed to reach some internal decision. This ain't over, girl, he shouted across the water. Your daddy's got men looking for you from here to California. You can run all you want, but eventually we'll catch up. And when we do, you're gonna wish you'd come home quiet like when you had the chance. The sound of retreating hoofbeats gradually faded, but Charlotte knew Calvin's threat wasn't idle. Her father possessed the resources and determination to continue the hunt indefinitely, using every tool at his disposal to reclaim what he considered his property. We need to change our route, Takoda said, already beginning to pack their few possessions. They'll be watching the main roads now, maybe even have men waiting at the stage stations. They were forced to abandon their planned path and strike out across country that grew more rugged and unforgiving with each mile. Charlotte's feet, barely healed from their earlier punishment, began to bleed again inside her makeshift moccasins. But fear drove her forward, not just fear of Calvin's cold eyes and her father's iron will, but fear of the cage that waited for her in Boston. For 3 days, they traveled through wilderness that seemed designed to test human endurance. They climbed rocky ridges that left Charlotte gasping in the thin air, crossed streams that threatened to sweep them away with their icy currents, and navigated forests so thick that sunlight barely penetrated to the ground. But Charlotte was changing with each challenge overcome. Her body was growing lean and hard, her reflexes sharpening, her understanding of the natural world deepening under Takoda's patient instruction. Most importantly, her spirit was hardening into something her father wouldn't recognize, something that refused to be broken or controlled. On their 4th evening, they crested a ridge and saw smoke rising from the valley below. But this wasn't the clean gray of wood fires, and it was the thick black column that spoke of industrial activity and environmental destruction on a massive scale. Mining operation, Takoda said grimly, studying the scene through a small spyglass he carried. They've been poisoning Willow Creek with mercury and arsenic for over 2 years. Downstream where my people fish and water their horses, everything dies. Charlotte squinted at the distant buildings, trying to make out details in the fading light. The operation was enormous, with dozens of structures clustered around what appeared to be the main shaft. Steam rose from various buildings, and she could see the constant movement of workers, even at this distance. Who owns it? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Burke Hanlon. Same man who pays raiders to steal from my people. Same man whose guns killed my brother. Takoda's voice was tight with controlled anger. And according to those shipping records, we found the same man who does business with your father. The pieces of a puzzle Charlotte hadn't known existed began falling into place with sickening clarity. Her father's late-night meetings, the maps of Western territories spread across his desk, the conversations that stopped whenever she entered the room. William Whitmore wasn't just building railroads, he was building an empire of exploitation that stretched across the continent. That night, they made camp in a grove of pine trees that offered concealment while still providing a view of the mining operation below. As darkness fell, Charlotte could see the glow of furnaces that never stopped burning the constant activity of men who worked around the clock to extract wealth from the earth. I need to get closer, Takoda said as they shared a meal of jerked beef and wild berries. Find out what kind of security they have, maybe gather evidence of what they're doing to the water. I'm coming with you. Too dangerous. You should stay here with the horse where it's safe. Charlotte shook her head firmly, drawing on reserves of determination she hadn't known she possessed. Calvin's men are still hunting us. If they find this camp while you're gone, I'm as good as dead, whether you're here or not. At least, if I'm with you, I might be able to help. Takoda studied her face in the firelight, and Charlotte saw the exact moment when he recognized that she was no longer the helpless city girl he had rescued from the overturned stagecoach. Her hands were calloused now, her body lean and strong from days of hard travel. More importantly, her eyes held a determination that hadn't been there before. You do exactly what I tell you, he said finally. No questions, no arguments, no matter what happens. Agreed. They left the paint horse hobbled in the pine grove and made their way down the mountainside on foot, moving like shadows through the darkness. The mining camp was even larger than it had appeared from above. Dozens of buildings clustered around the main operations, with guards patrolling the perimeter and dogs chained near the workers' quarters. Charlotte's heart raced as they crept closer to what appeared to be the main office building, a two-story structure that stood apart from the rest of the industrial chaos. Light showed in the windows of the upper floor, and voices carried on the night air, men discussing business in the comfortable tones of those who had never known want or hardship. As they drew nearer, one of those voices made Charlotte's blood freeze in her veins. She would have recognized it anywhere, having heard it countless times in her father's study during late-night business meetings. That's Burke Hanlon. She breathed, her voice barely audible, even to herself. They crept closer, using the deep shadows cast by the building to mask their approach. Through a partially open window, Charlotte could see three men gathered around a desk covered with maps and documents. Hanlon was exactly as she remembered him from his visits to Boston, a big man with soft hands and calculating eyes, expensive clothes that spoke of Eastern wealth. But it was something else about him that made Charlotte's heart nearly stop beating. In the lamplight, she could see his profile clearly for the first time, and the resemblance was unmistakable. The same auburn hair as her mother, the same green eyes, the same delicate bone structure that Charlotte had inherited. My God. She whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. He looks just like... Before she could finish the thought, Hanlon himself provided the answer that explained everything. I received another telegram from my dear brother-in-law today. He was saying to his companions, his voice carrying clearly through the night air. William is becoming increasingly impatient about his wayward daughter. Apparently, the girl has been missing for weeks, and he's desperate to get her back before she can cause any real damage to the family reputation. Charlotte felt the world tilt around her as the implications sank in like poison. Burke Hanlon wasn't just her father's business partner, he was her uncle, her mother's brother family she had never known existed. What's the plan if we find her? Asked one of the other men. Bring her back alive if possible. Hanlon replied with a casual brutality that chilled Charlotte to the bone. William wants the pleasure of dealing with her personally. Something about teaching her the proper respect for family authority. The conversation that followed revealed the full scope of the criminal conspiracy between Charlotte's father and uncle. They weren't just partners in legitimate business. They were coordinating a campaign of violence and intimidation designed to drive Native Americans from valuable land throughout the Wyoming Territory. But it was what came next that shattered Charlotte's understanding of her own family history. Speaking of family loyalty, Hanlon continued pouring himself a glass of expensive whiskey. I still think you made the right choice with Mary all those years ago. She was getting too soft, asking too many questions about our methods out here. My wife understood the necessities of business eventually. Came another voice, one that made Charlotte's heart stop completely. Her father stepped into view at the window, his familiar profile silhouetted against the lamplight. William Whitmore looked older than she remembered, his hair completely gray now, but his voice carried the same note of absolute authority that had dominated her childhood. Mary's conscience was becoming a liability. He continued with chilling matter-of-factness. The consumption story was much cleaner than the truth would have been. No messy investigations, no uncomfortable questions from the authorities. Charlotte felt her knees go weak as the horrible truth sank in. Her mother hadn't died of natural causes. She had been murdered by her own husband because she had threatened to expose his criminal activities. The consumption diagnosis, the gradual wasting away, the careful nursing that had kept visitors away during her final months, it had all been an elaborate cover-up. The girl has her mother's willful streak, Hanlon observed. We may need to use similar methods if she proves unmanageable. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, William Whitmore replied. Charlotte is valuable as a bargaining chip with the Blackwood family. Dead daughters are much less useful than obedient ones. Takoda's hand closed over Charlotte's mouth just in time to muffle her gasp of horror and rage. She was shaking now, not from cold, but from the devastating revelation of how thoroughly she had been betrayed by the people who were supposed to love and protect her. We've heard enough, Takoda whispered in her ear, his voice urgent with the need to escape before their presence was discovered. But as they turned to leave, Charlotte's foot struck a discarded piece of mining equipment. The metallic clang seemed to echo like thunder in the still night air. And immediately, they heard voices raised in alarm from inside the office. What was that? Someone's out there. Check the perimeter immediately. Dogs began barking throughout the camp, and the sound of running feet echoed from multiple directions as guards responded to the alarm. Charlotte and Takoda ran for the tree line, abandoning stealth for speed. Shouts erupted behind them, and torches began moving through the compound like angry fireflies. They had almost reached the safety of the pine grove when Calvin Dorsey stepped out from behind a massive boulder, his rifle trained on Charlotte's chest. In the moonlight, she could see that his shoulder wound had been crudely bandaged, but his eyes burned with hatred and the promise of violence. "End of the road, honey," he said with a grin that showed his tobacco-stained teeth. "Your daddy and uncle have been real patient, but their patience just ran out." Behind Calvin, 4 more men emerged from concealment, their weapons glinting in the pale light. Charlotte realized with sick certainty that they had walked into a carefully prepared trap orchestrated by men who knew the territory and had unlimited resources for hunting down fugitives. "Don't even think about trying anything heroic, Injun." Calvin continued his rifle, never wavering from Charlotte's heart. "I got orders to bring the girl back breathing, but nobody said nothing about keeping you alive." The silence that followed seemed to stretch across eternity. Charlotte could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could smell the acrid smoke from the mining operations, could feel Takoda's tension radiating through the darkness beside her. That's when the first arrow took Calvin's hat clean off his head, the fletching whistling through the air with deadly precision. The attack came from 3 directions at once, Cheyenne warriors materializing from the darkness like vengeful spirits, their war cries echoing off the mountainsides as they charged into Calvin's men with rifles and tomahawks gleaming in the moonlight. Charlotte threw herself flat as bullets whined overhead, pressing her face into the pine needles and trying to make herself as small as possible, while chaos erupted around her. The sound was overwhelming gunshots, cracking like thundermen, screaming in pain and terror, horses neighing in panic as they caught the scent of blood and violence. The fight was brief, but savage, conducted with a brutality that would have horrified Charlotte's Boston sensibilities just weeks earlier. When the gun smoke finally cleared, 3 of Calvin's men lay dead in spreading pools of blood, and the 4th was running for his life down the mountainside, crashing through brush in his desperation to escape. Calvin himself crouched behind a fallen log, blood streaming from a fresh scalp wound where a Cheyenne bullet had creased his skull. His rifle was lost somewhere in the chaos, and his eyes held the wild look of a man who had suddenly found himself on the wrong end of superior firepower. The Cheyenne warrior who approached Charlotte and Takoda was younger than she had expected, perhaps 25, with intricate beadwork decorating his buckskin shirt and eagle feathers woven into his braided hair. But she could see the family resemblance immediately in his high cheekbones and intelligent dark eyes. "Waya," Takoda said, embracing the younger man with obvious relief and affection. Waya responded in rapid Cheyenne, his words coming too fast for Charlotte to follow, even if she had understood the language. But she caught her father's name being mentioned, and she saw Waya's expression harden with unmistakable hostility as he looked at her. "My cousin doesn't trust you," Takoda explained, switching to English for Charlotte's benefit. "He calls you the railroad man's daughter and wonders why I've been traveling with our people's enemy." Charlotte stepped forward, despite the rifle barrels pointed in her direction, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. The revelation about her mother's murder, about her own family's monstrous crimes, had burned away her last connection to her former life. She was no longer William Whitmore's daughter in any meaningful sense. "Tell him I've learned what my father and uncle really are," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions raging inside her. "Tell him I want to help stop the men who murdered your brother and poisoned your people's water." The discussion that followed was conducted entirely in Cheyenne, with voices rising and falling as the warriors debated what to do with her. Charlotte caught occasional words she recognized from her time with Takoda, but the conversation was too rapid and complex for her limited understanding. Finally, Waya nodded reluctantly and spoke directly to Charlotte in heavily accented English. "You prove words with actions. Words or wind actions show truth of heart." "What kind of actions?" Charlotte asked. But before anyone could answer, Calvin chose that moment to make his desperate move. The wounded enforcer lunged from behind his fallen log, a knife gleaming in his hand, as he aimed for Charlotte's back in a last vicious attempt to complete his mission. Waya was faster as tomahawk, catching Calvin in the shoulder with bone-crushing force and spinning him around to crash face first into the rocky ground. The knife flew from nerveless fingers, clattering harmlessly among the stones. "That for horses he stole from my grandfather," Waya said grimly, then switched to rapid Cheyenne as he bound Calvin's hands with rawhide strips. They made camp in a hidden canyon several miles from the mining operation, where a small spring provided fresh water and the high walls offered protection from prying eyes. Charlotte learned that Waya led a band of young warriors who had grown tired of watching their people's suffering, while the tribal elders urged patience and accommodation with white authorities. "The old ways don't work anymore," Waya explained as they sat around a carefully shielded fire, speaking in the mixture of English and Cheyenne that had become their common language. "White men understand only strength. They take what they want until someone makes them stop taking." "What are you planning to do?" Charlotte asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Strike back. Hit their supply trains, burn their equipment, kill their raiders before they can kill more of our families. Make it too expensive for them to stay on our ancestral lands." Charlotte felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. That will bring the army down on your heads like an avalanche. My father has connections in Washington. One letter from him could turn this into a military campaign that would scatter your people to the winds. Then what do you suggest, railroad daughter? Wyatt asked with barely concealed skepticism. Charlotte stared into the flames, thinking of everything she had seen and heard over the past weeks. An idea was forming in her mind, dangerous and ambitious, but possibly their only hope of achieving justice without triggering a massacre. Evidence, she said finally. Proof of their crimes that's so overwhelming even corrupt officials can't ignore it. Documents, witness testimony, maybe even photographs of what they're doing to your land and people. And where would we find such evidence? Takoda asked quietly. Charlotte remembered the office building at the mining camp, the maps and documents she had glimpsed through the window before their discovery and escape. Hanlon keeps records of everything: shipping manifests, payroll records, correspondence with government officials. If we could get our hands on those papers. The camp is too well guarded, Wyatt objected. We'd need a small army to fight our way in and out again. Not if someone walked in the front door, Charlotte said quietly. Someone they wouldn't suspect of having hostile intentions. The plan they eventually devised was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its risks. Charlotte would use her family connections and natural bearing to gain entry to Hanlon's operation, posing as a representative sent by her father to review their partnership's progress. Meanwhile, Takoda and Wyatt would position themselves to create a distraction if things went wrong. If you're captured or killed, we can't save you, Takoda warned as they prepared for the mission. The risk to the entire band would be too great. I understand, Charlotte replied, checking the small pistol he had taught her to use during their travels. But this is our chance to gather the evidence we need to bring them down through legal means instead of starting a war. And if the legal means fail, Charlotte met his gaze steadily. Then at least we'll have tried the civilized approach first. Your people will be able to say they sought justice through white man's laws before resorting to white man's violence. As dawn broke over the mountains, Charlotte made her way toward Hanlon's mining operation, with her heart hammering against her ribs. She had cleaned herself as thoroughly as possible with the limited water available, arranged her hair in a style that suggested authority and refinement, and practiced her story until it sounded natural. The guards at the main gate looked her up and down with obvious suspicion, taking in her travel-worn dress and the fact that she was traveling alone through dangerous territory. But the mention of the Whitmore name worked like magic, transforming their hostility into nervous deference. My Miss Whitmore. We wasn't expecting. That is, Mr. Hanlon didn't mention. Please, right this way, miss. The boss will want to see you immediately. Within minutes, she was being escorted through the compound by a nervous foreman who clearly wanted to make a good impression on the daughter of his employer's most important business partner. The mining operation was even more massive up close, with dozens of workers laboring in conditions that would have been considered criminal in the civilized East. Burke Hanlon's office was exactly what Charlotte had expected, a monument to wealth and power, built from imported materials that must have cost a fortune to transport across the wilderness. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, oil paintings hung on walls lined with expensive books, and crystal decanters filled with aged whiskey sat on a sidebar that probably cost more than most people's annual wages. Hanlon himself rose from behind an enormous desk, made from polished mahogany, his smile as false and calculated as a politician's campaign promise. In the daylight, his resemblance to Charlotte's mother was even more pronounced, making his casual brutality all the more horrifying. Miss Whitmore. What an unexpected pleasure. His voice was warm and welcoming, but Charlotte could see the calculating look in his eyes as he tried to determine why she was here. I was just corresponding with your father about our various joint ventures. That's precisely why I'm here, Uncle Burke, Charlotte said smoothly, using the family connection to establish her authority while watching his reaction carefully. Hanlon's smile faltered for just an instant before reasserting itself with renewed force. "Uncle, my dear girl, I think there's been some confusion." "No confusion at all." Charlotte interrupted, settling into a leather chair that probably cost more than most people made in a year. "I know exactly who you are. Mother spoke of you often before her death." The lie came easily, but Charlotte could see it had hit its mark. Hanlon's face cycled through surprise calculation, and finally a grudging acceptance of the family connection he couldn't deny. "So you're Mary's daughter," he said slowly, studying her face with new interest. "The resemblance is quite strong now that I look more carefully. Your mother was a remarkable woman." "Yes, she was. And she taught me to appreciate the finer points of business management." Charlotte let her Boston accent sharpen her words, projecting the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Father sent me to personally review our territorial operations and ensure everything is proceeding according to plan. It was a masterful deception, vague enough to seem important, while specific enough to demand attention." Hanlon's calculating expression suggested he was trying to determine how much she actually knew about their activities. "Of course, my dear niece. I'd be delighted to show you around our operation." He poured himself a glass of whiskey with hands that trembled slightly. "I trust your father as well. His last letter mentioned some concerns about territorial politics." For the next 2 hours, Hanlon showed Charlotte ledgers and correspondence that documented the full scope of his criminal enterprise. She listened with growing horror as he proudly explained how bribes were distributed to territorial officials, how weapons shipments were arranged through shell companies, how systematic intimidation was used to drive Native Americans from valuable land. "Of course, we've had some trouble with the local savages," he said, refilling his glass with expensive liquor. "But your father's rifles have helped us establish proper order in the territory. The latest shipment was particularly effective in discouraging organized resistance." Charlotte kept her expression neutral, despite the bile rising in her throat. "Efficiency is essential for profitable operations." "Indeed. We're actually preparing to send a comprehensive report to Washington about increased Indian aggression in our area. Should justify a military response that will clear the remaining obstacles to full development." But it was the photograph on his desk that provided the final devastating piece of the puzzle. Charlotte had noticed it earlier, a family portrait that showed a young woman who looked remarkably like her mother. Now she could see the inscription clearly: "To my beloved brother Burke, with all my love. Mary Hanlon, 1857. Her mother's maiden name. The proof of their family connection and the evidence that Mary Whitmore had indeed been murdered for threatening to expose her husband and brother's criminal activities. "Mother looks so happy in that picture," Charlotte said carefully, pointing to the photograph. Hanlon's expression softened with what might have been genuine emotion. "That was taken just before her wedding to your father. Mary was always the idealist in our family, unfortunately. She believed people could change that wealth and power could be used for good rather than just profit. She was naive." Charlotte agreed, though the words tasted like poison on her tongue, dangerously so toward the end. She started asking uncomfortable questions about our methods out here, threatening to expose activities that were essential for territorial development. Hanlon's voice hardened. "Your father handled the situation with his usual efficiency, though I admit I was sad to see Mary go." Charlotte felt her hands clench involuntarily as he casually admitted to complicity in her mother's murder. But she forced herself to remain calm, to continue playing the role of the dutiful daughter who understood the necessities of business. "Father mentioned that you've been having some difficulty with a particular troublemaker," she said, fishing for more information. "Someone named Ayanna, dealt with permanently 2 years ago." Hanlon replied with satisfaction. "Young buck who was organizing resistance among the tribes, teaching them to use legal means to challenge our land acquisitions. Your father's contacts in the territorial government made sure he won't be filing any more complaints." The casual admission of Takoda's brother's murder was delivered with the same tone Hanlon might have used to discuss the weather. Charlotte realized she was sitting across from a man who had ordered the deaths of countless innocent people without losing a moment's sleep over their suffering. But it was what happened next that nearly destroyed her carefully maintained composure. Hanlon reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a leather-bound journal, opening it to a page covered with neat handwriting. "I keep detailed records of all our operations," he explained, apparently eager to impress his newly discovered niece with his organizational skills. Names, dates, methods used, results achieved. Essential for maintaining efficiency and avoiding unnecessary complications. Charlotte's eyes scanned the page he showed her, and her blood turned to ice as she read entry after entry, describing murders, raids, and acts of terrorism carried out in the name of territorial development. Ayana's name was there, along with dozens of others, men, women, and children, whose only crime had been standing in the way of Hanlon's greed. But it was the final entry that made her heart stop completely. Written in Hanlon's careful script was a detailed plan for eliminating remaining obstacles to final territorial pacification, including specific mention of Takoda and his band of troublesome warriors. "You're planning to kill them all," Charlotte whispered, her voice barely audible. "Within the month, according to our current timeline," Hanlon confirmed with chilling matter-of-factness. "We've identified their hiding places, mapped their movement patterns, even recruited a few tribal members who are willing to provide intelligence in exchange for safe passage to Canada." Charlotte felt the world spinning around her as she realized the full scope of the trap that was closing around Takoda and his people. Not only were they being hunted by well-armed enemies with superior resources, but they were being betrayed by members of their own community. "I should be going," she said, rising from her chair on unsteady legs. "Father will want a full report on everything I've seen here." "Of course, my dear. But first, there's something else I need to discuss with you." Hanlon's voice carried a new edge that made Charlotte's skin crawl with foreboding. "You see, I know exactly why you're really here." The pretense shattered like glass hitting stone. Charlotte saw the trap closing around her even as she reached for the pistol hidden in her dress, but Hanlon was faster, producing a small derringer from his desk drawer with practiced ease. "Did you really think I wouldn't recognize William Whitmore's runaway daughter?" he asked with a smile that never reached his cold eyes. "The girl who's been causing so much trouble for our operations throughout the territory." "I don't know what you mean." "Please, Charlotte. We're family after all. No need for pretense between relatives." Hanlon gestured toward the window where she could see Calvin Dorsey and several armed men positioning themselves around the building. "My dear brother-in-law has been frantic with worry about your welfare. He'll be so relieved to learn you're safe." Charlotte's mind raced as she calculated her options. The window was too far away, the door was blocked by Hanlon's bulk, and the derringer in his hand was pointed steadily at her chest. She was trapped in the office of a man who had casually admitted to murdering her mother and planning the deaths of everyone she had come to care about. "What do you want?" she asked, buying time, while her eyes searched for any possible escape route. "Cooperation, my dear niece. Your father and I have invested considerable resources in this territory, and we can't allow sentimental attachments to interfere with business necessities." Hanlon's voice was reasonable, almost gentle, but his eyes remained cold as winter steel. "You're going to help us eliminate the remaining obstacles to our plans. I'll never help you hurt innocent people." "Oh, but you will. You see, we have something you care about." He gestured toward the window again, and Charlotte's heart sank as she saw Takoda being dragged into the compound by Calvin's men, his hands bound behind his back and blood streaming from a wound on his forehead. "We found your savage friend trying to infiltrate our security perimeter," Hanlon explained with obvious satisfaction. "Quite foolish of him, really. Now you have a choice to make: cooperate with our plans or watch him die very slowly and very painfully. Charlotte stared at Takoda through the window, seeing the man who had saved her life, taught her to survive, and shown her what true courage looked like. The thought of him suffering because of her foolish attempt at espionage was unbearable. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Charlotte remembered something Takoda had told her during their first night together. In this country, you survive by being smarter and tougher than whatever's trying to kill you. All right, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the terror raging inside her. I'll cooperate, just don't hurt him. Excellent. I knew you were a sensible girl beneath all that romantic nonsense. Hanlon moved toward the door, but Charlotte was already in motion, her hand closing around the heavy crystal decanter on his sidebar. The expensive whiskey exploded across Hanlon's face as Charlotte swung the decanter with all her strength, the cut crystal opening a gash across his forehead that sent blood streaming into his eyes. He staggered backward, the derringer flying from nerveless fingers, and Charlotte dove for the window without hesitation. Glass exploded around her as she crashed through the frame, landing hard on the wooden walkway outside. Pain shot through her shoulder where she hit the planking, but adrenaline drove her to her feet as shouts erupted throughout the compound. Stop her! Hanlon's voice roared from inside the office. Don't let the bitch escape. Charlotte ran toward the supply sheds on the edge of the camp, hoping to reach Takoda before Calvin's men could organize an effective pursuit. Behind her, rifles cracked and bullets whined through the air. But running men make poor marksmen, and most of the shots went wide. She found Takoda tied to a post near the equipment barn, his face bloody, but his eyes alert and determined. Charlotte, what are you doing here? Getting us out of this mess, she replied, using the knife he had taught her to carry to cut his bonds. Can you run better than I can fly? He said grimly, rubbing circulation back into his wrists. That's when Charlotte saw the dynamite. The supply shed stood open nearby, its interior filled with cases of explosives and coils of fuse wire used in the mining operations. Without hesitation, she grabbed an armload of dynamite sticks and the longest fuse she could find. What are you planning? Takoda asked, but Charlotte was already lighting the fuse with a match from her pocket. Creating a distraction, she replied, tossing the bundle of explosives through the open door of the shed. They ran for the tree line, as Charlotte counted down the seconds in her head, hoping her estimate of the fuse length was accurate. Behind them, she could hear Calvin shouting orders and the sound of pursuing footsteps growing closer. The explosion that followed seemed to shake the very mountains. The supply shed vanished in a pillar of fire and smoke that rose hundreds of feet into the morning sky, taking with it a section of the main compound and half a dozen nearby buildings. The shock wave knocked men from their feet and sent horses screaming in terror as debris rained down like deadly hail. In the chaos that followed, Charlotte and Takoda reached the pine grove where Waya waited with their horses. Did you get what we needed? Waya shouted over the noise of the continuing explosions as secondary fires spread through the compound. Charlotte patted the pocket of her dress where she had hidden several pages from Hanlon's journal during the confusion. Enough to hang them all if we can get it to the right people. They rode hard for 3 days, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Hanlon's remaining forces. The mining compound continued to burn behind them, sending a column of black smoke into the sky that could be seen for 50 miles. But Charlotte knew their victory was temporary. Men like Hanlon and her father didn't give up easily, and they had vast resources to draw upon for continued pursuit. On their 4th night, they made camp in a hidden valley where a small stream provided fresh water and the high walls offered protection from observation. As they sat around their carefully shielded fire, Charlotte finally had time to process everything she had learned about her family's criminal activities. Your uncle admitted to murdering your mother. Takoda observed quietly, watching her face in the flickering light. Charlotte nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks as the full impact of the revelation hit her. She tried to stop them, tried to expose what they were doing out here. So they killed her and made it look like natural causes. And your father was there when they planned it. Probably helped arrange the whole thing. Charlotte's voice was barely a whisper as she spoke the words that damned her entire family. The consumption story, the gradual decline, the way visitors were kept away during her final months, it was all carefully orchestrated. Wyatt spoke up from across the fire, his English improving daily through necessity. This knowledge gives you power over them. White man's law might listen if railroad daughter speaks truth about railroad crimes. Then maybe, a full cart. Charlotte agreed, though she wasn't optimistic about her chances of getting a fair hearing from territorial authorities who were already bought and paid for by men like her father. But Takoda had a different suggestion, one that would require more courage than Charlotte had ever needed before. There's going to be a gathering of the tribal councils next week, he said quietly. Leaders from several bands coming together to decide how to respond to the increasing attacks on our people. What does that have to do with us? They need to hear what you learned in Hanlon's office. The evidence you gathered, the plans you overheard it, could help them understand the full scope of what they're facing. Charlotte felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. They'll never trust the word of a white woman, especially one whose father has been supplying weapons to their enemies. Maybe not, Takoda admitted. But Wyatt will speak for you, and so will I. And the documents you took might be enough to convince them that you're telling the truth. The journey to the tribal gathering took 2 more days through country that grew more beautiful and forbidding with each mile. They traveled through forests of pine and aspen, where the leaves had turned gold with autumn's touch, across meadows carpeted with wildflowers that would soon be buried under winter snow, and along ridges that offered views of mountain ranges stretching to the horizon. Charlotte's transformation was now complete in all but name. Her hands were calloused from weeks of hard living, her body lean and strong from constant travel and irregular meals. Her expensive dress had been replaced by buckskin clothing that Wyatt's sister had made for her practical garments that wouldn't tear on thorns or restrict her movement when stealth was necessary. But it was her spirit that had changed most dramatically. The frightened girl who had fled Boston was gone, replaced by a woman who had learned to face danger with clear eyes and steady hands. She could start a fire in the rain track animals by their sign and handle a rifle well enough to contribute to their defense if necessary. More importantly, she had found a cause worth fighting for, a purpose that transcended her own safety and comfort. The systematic oppression of the Cheyenne people, the environmental destruction caused by unregulated mining, the corruption that allowed men like her father and uncle to operate with impunity, these were injustices that demanded action regardless of personal cost. The tribal gathering was held in a hidden valley that had been sacred to the Cheyenne for countless generations. Nearly 300 people had assembled from bands across the territory, representing the largest concentration of tribal leadership that Charlotte had ever witnessed. The sight was both inspiring and heartbreaking, a proud people struggling to maintain their identity and independence in the face of overwhelming pressure to surrender or die. The arrival of a white woman caused considerable stir among the assembled tribes. People emerged from their lodges to stare at Charlotte, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. She could hear her father's name being whispered in conversations she couldn't understand, and she knew that the Whitmore reputation had preceded her into this sacred place. Chief Running Bear. The elderly leader, who served as the gathering's primary moderator, listened without expression as Takoda and Wyatt explained Charlotte's presence. His weathered face revealed nothing of his thoughts, as they described her discoveries about Hanlon's operations and her family's involvement in the systematic persecution of Native Americans. The railroad chief's daughter seeks to help those her father has wronged. Running Bear said finally, speaking in English for Charlotte's benefit. But words are like snow in spring, they melt quickly when tested by heat. What actions prove the sincerity of her words? Charlotte took a deep breath, knowing that her answer would determine not only her own fate, but possibly the future of everyone in this valley. She pulled out the pages from Hanlon's journal, along with several other documents she had managed to steal during her escape. "These are the records of my uncle's crimes," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still mountain air. "Names, dates, methods used to murder your people and steal your land. Evidence that could be used in white man's courts if we can find judges who aren't already bought by railroad money." The documents were passed from hand to hand around the circle of leaders, translated and explained by those who could read English. Charlotte watched their faces as they absorbed the full scope of the conspiracy against them, seeing anger and grief and a terrible understanding of just how thoroughly they had been betrayed. But it was Chief Running Bear's next question that cut to the heart of Charlotte's dilemma. If we use this evidence to seek justice through white man's law, what happens to you? Your father and uncle will know you betrayed them. Then I'll face whatever consequences come. Charlotte replied without hesitation. My family has committed terrible crimes in the name of profit. If exposing those crimes destroys my place in their world, then so be it. The war council that followed lasted through the night and into the next day, with speaker after speaker rising to debate their options. Some advocated for immediate retaliation, striking back at their oppressors with the same violence that had been used against them. Others counseled patience and negotiation, hoping to find some accommodation that would allow their people to survive with dignity intact. But gradually, a consensus began to emerge around Charlotte's suggestion of using legal means to seek justice. The evidence she had provided was too valuable to ignore, and the potential consequences of armed resistance were too catastrophic to accept without trying other alternatives first. "We will send representatives to Washington," Chief Running Bear announced as the council reached its decision. "Let the Great Father hear the truth about what his agents are doing in our territory. If white man's law has any meaning at all, it must respond to such clear evidence of crime and corruption." "Who will carry this evidence to Washington?" asked one of the younger leaders. All eyes turned to Charlotte, and she felt the weight of their expectations settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. These people were trusting her with their lives, their futures, their children's hopes for survival, in a world that seemed determined to destroy them. "I'll go," she said quietly. "It's my responsibility to see this through to the end." But Wyatt had a different suggestion, one that surprised everyone, including Charlotte herself. "I will go with her," he announced, rising to his feet with the dignity that seemed to come naturally to all the young warriors she had met. "Our people need a voice in the Great Father's council, someone who can speak for us when the lawyers and politicians try to twist the truth." The decision to send both Charlotte and Wyatt to Washington was not reached without considerable debate. Many of the tribal elders worried about the risks involved: the long journey through hostile territory, the possibility of assassination or accidents arranged by powerful enemies, the likelihood that even honest government officials might dismiss their evidence as fabricated or irrelevant. But in the end, the potential rewards outweighed the dangers. If they could successfully expose the criminal conspiracy between railroad interests and territorial authorities, it might lead to federal intervention that could protect Native American rights throughout the Western territories. The journey to Washington took nearly a month and tested every survival skill Charlotte had learned during her time in the wilderness. They traveled mostly by train, using false identities and carefully planned routes to avoid detection by her father's agents. But several times they were forced to abandon their transportation and continue on foot when Pinkerton detectives or federal marshals got too close to their trail. Each time, Charlotte's ability to survive in rough country proved invaluable, allowing them to disappear into the wilderness until the immediate danger passed. Wyatt proved to be an ideal traveling companion, despite his initial suspicion of white civilization, his natural dignity and intelligence impressing everyone they encountered along the way. But it was in a small town in Missouri that Charlotte received news that changed everything. While waiting for their connecting train, She happened to pick up a newspaper that contained a story that made her heart stop beating. William Whitmore, the railroad magnate, was found dead in his Boston mansion yesterday morning. She read aloud to Wyatt, her voice shaking with shock and a confusion of emotions. Police are investigating what appears to be suicide, though family friends report he had been despondent over recent business reversals and personal difficulties. Charlotte stared at the newspaper in stunned silence, trying to process the implications of her father's death. Part of her felt grief for the loss of the only parent she had ever known, but a larger part felt relief that she would never again have to face his cold disapproval or fear his ruthless retaliation. "You think this is really suicide?" Wyatt asked, studying her face with concern. "I don't know," Charlotte admitted. Father wasn't the type to give up easily, even when facing ruin. And there are other people who might have wanted him dead: business rivals, political enemies, maybe even Hanlon himself, if he thought Father was becoming a liability. The mystery of William Whitmore's death would never be fully resolved. But Charlotte suspected that her uncle had eliminated a potential witness who knew too much about their joint criminal activities. It was the kind of cold-blooded calculation that she had come to expect from men who measured human lives in terms of profit and loss. Washington, in the winter of 1879, was a city struggling to define its role in a rapidly expanding nation. The congressional hearing room where Charlotte finally told her story was packed with reporters, lobbyists, and curious politicians who had come to see the railroad baron's daughter testify against her own family's interests. Charlotte's testimony lasted for 3 days, during which she methodically laid out the evidence of corruption and criminal conspiracy that she and Takoda had risked their lives to obtain. The documents from Hanlon's journal proved their case beyond reasonable doubt, while Wyatt's first-hand accounts of attacks on Cheyenne communities provided the human dimension that made the crimes real to the listening congressman. But it was on the final day of hearings that Charlotte received the most shocking revelation of all. As she was leaving the Capitol building, a familiar figure approached her in the marble corridor: Patterson, the telegraph operator who had been working with both her father and the Cheyenne trader. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I need to speak with you about your father's death." Charlotte's first instinct was to call for help, but something in Patterson's manner suggested he wasn't there to threaten her. Instead, he seemed nervous, almost frightened, as if he were taking an enormous risk by approaching her. "What do you know about it?" she asked warily. "More than I wish I did," Patterson replied. "You see, I've been working for federal investigators for the past year, gathering evidence about your father and uncle's activities in the territories. When your testimony started making headlines, my superiors decided it was time to move against them directly." Charlotte felt her knees go weak as the implications sank in. "You're a federal agent." He was. "My cover's blown now, obviously. But before I was discovered, I managed to learn the truth about William Whitmore's death." Patterson's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "It wasn't suicide, Miss Whitmore. Your father was murdered by Burke Hanlon's men on his direct orders." The revelation hit Charlotte like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs. Even knowing what kind of man her father had been, even understanding the terrible crimes he had committed, the knowledge that he had been murdered by his own partner was devastating. "Why?" she managed to ask. "Because Hanlon couldn't risk having him testify before Congress couldn't let him reveal the full extent of their partnership under oath. Dead men don't make inconvenient confessions or implicate their business associates in federal crimes." Charlotte leaned against the marble wall for support, overwhelmed by the realization that her family had been destroyed not by justice or conscience, but by the same greed and violence that had built their empire. Her father had died as he had lived a victim of the brutal system he had helped create. But Patterson had more news information that would determine the success or failure of everything Charlotte had sacrificed to achieve. Federal marshals arrested Burke Hanlon this morning at his ranch in Wyoming Territory. He continued, The evidence you provided, combined with what I gathered during my undercover work, was enough to secure warrants for him and 17 of his associates. True to Patterson's word, the trial that followed became a national sensation, with newspapers across the country covering every detail of the proceedings. The evidence against Hanlon was overwhelming, not just Charlotte's testimony and the documents she had provided, but also detailed reports from Patterson's investigation and testimony from survivors of attacks on Native American communities. Hanlon was eventually convicted of conspiracy murder and a dozen other federal crimes that sent him to prison for the rest of his life. Several territorial officials lost their positions and faced criminal charges of their own, while new laws were passed to protect Native American land rights and regulate mining operations in sensitive areas. The systematic violence that had characterized the Wyoming Territory began to subside as federal oversight increased and corrupt officials were removed from power. It wasn't a complete victory. Too many people had died. Too much damage had been done for any outcome to fully balance the scales of justice. But it was a beginning, a foundation for building something better. For Charlotte personally, the victory came at a cost that she had anticipated but never fully prepared for. Her father's empire was destroyed, her family name disgraced, and what remained of her inheritance was tied up in legal proceedings that would last for years, while the government sought restitution for the crimes that had generated the Whitmore fortune. More importantly, she had lost any chance of reconciling with the man who had shaped her early life, however badly. William Whitmore had died, believing his daughter had betrayed him, never knowing that she had acted out of love for justice rather than hatred for family. But Charlotte discovered that freedom from her father's expectations, however painful, had given her something more valuable than money or social position. For the first time in her life, she was free to choose her own path, to define herself by her own values, rather than someone else's requirements. She never returned to Boston. Using the small portion of her inheritance that wasn't tied up in legal proceedings, Charlotte established a school for Native American children in Colorado Territory, where she spent the rest of her life teaching and advocating for indigenous rights. The Whitmore School, as it came to be known, became a model for education that respected Native American culture, while preparing young people to succeed in an increasingly complex world. Charlotte developed curricula that preserved traditional knowledge, while teaching practical skills needed for survival in white-dominated society. But perhaps most importantly, she maintained her connections with the people who had saved her life and taught her the true meaning of courage. Waya remained in Washington for several years after the congressional hearing, studying law at Georgetown University and eventually becoming one of the first Native American attorneys in the country. Her correspondence with Takoda continued until his death in 1923, a relationship that sustained and inspired her through decades of challenging work. He wrote to her about his efforts to establish a reservation that allowed the Cheyenne to maintain some degree of autonomy, about his marriage to a woman whose courage reminded him of Charlotte's transformation in the wilderness, and about the children who would carry their people's traditions into an uncertain future. But Charlotte treasured most the letter he sent her on the 20th anniversary of their first meeting, in which he wrote, "You asked me once what freedom meant, and I told you it was what you do with the road ahead. You have used your freedom well, Charlotte Whitmore. You have honored the memory of my brother and the hopes of my people. You have turned the weapons of our enemies against them and won victories that no warrior could achieve with rifle or tomahawk." That is a legacy any person would be proud to claim. When Charlotte died in 1934, students at her school found among her papers hundreds of letters from former pupils who had gone on to become teachers, doctors, lawyers, and leaders in their own communities. They also found a beaded wristband that had belonged to Waya, a reminder of the young warrior who had risked everything to carry their message to Washington. On her deathbed, Charlotte was heard to whisper words that Takoda had spoken to her beside a campfire in the Wyoming wilderness all those years ago. "Freedom isn't a place you go to, it's what you do with the road ahead." She had spent her life proving the truth of those words, transforming herself from a frightened girl fleeing an arranged marriage into a woman who helped change the course of American history. The railroad money that had once seemed so important proved to be nothing compared to the wealth she found in standing up for justice, regardless of personal cost. Charlotte Whitmore died as she had chosen to live, after leaving Boston free from the expectations and limitations that others had tried to impose on her, secure in the knowledge that she had used her freedom to make the world more just and compassionate. In her final journal entry, written just days before her death, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from Boston's mansions to Colorado's mountains. "I thought I was running away from something when I boarded that train so many years ago. Now I understand that I was running toward something, toward the person I was meant to become, toward the work I was meant to do, toward the freedom that comes not from avoiding responsibility, but from choosing it willingly, no matter how steep the price." The frontier that had tested and transformed her was already disappearing by the time of her death, replaced by cities and highways and the relentless advance of industrial civilization. But the lessons she had learned in the wilderness about courage and integrity and the true cost of justice proved to be timeless truths that outlasted the world that had created them. Charlotte Whitmore's greatest victory wasn't the congressional testimony that brought down corrupt officials or the legal precedents that protected Native American rights. It was the simple but profound act of choosing to become the person she was meant to be, rather than the person others expected her to be. That choice, made in a moment of terror beside an overturned stagecoach in the Wyoming Territory, echoed through the decades that followed and inspired countless others to find their own courage when faced with impossible decisions. Freedom, as Takoda had taught her, wasn't a destination, but a journey. And Charlotte Whitmore had made that journey with grace, determination, and an unshakable commitment to justice that transformed not only her own life, but the lives of everyone she touched.